Hello and welcome to the first episode and maiden voyage of the Great Unlearning podcast series with me, Don Bryan. These are going to be a series of podcasts, I hope, where I'm going to be looking at this age now, comparing it maybe to previous ages, and how we are being how society is being, I would suggest, manipulated to not critically look at some of the elements and constructs and paradigms that we have ongoing in our society. And that being said, in this first episode, I want to talk about mass psychosis and why I think this needs to be examined as a concept, why we should be thinking about this as maybe something that is happening now, and comparing that with historical examples that we know of where mass psychosis has occurred in various regimes and epochs, and what the result of those regimes have been. So what do I mean by mass psychosis, or what definition could we use to describe what mass psychosis is? So mass psychosis in a kind of clinical sense might also, or academic sense, might also be described as epidemic hysteria or mass hysteria. So what might be an accepted definition of mass hysteria? So I'll read out what I have taken from Wikipedia, so it must be true, for a definition of mass hysteria. So in terms of sociology and psychology, mass hysteria is a phenomenon that transmits a collective illusion of threats, whether real or imaginary, through a population and society as a result of rumours and fear. So that definition, as I say, kind of might be a more clinical definition and might be used more, it might be framed more often to describe outbreaks of types of syndrome, such as there's been a few outbreaks in the last 30 or 40 years in America of seemingly in high schools of neurological tics or nervous system related illnesses and behaviour. So that's what epidemic hysteria might more often be used to describe, as kind of those kind of very kind of localized events where one individual starts behaving or displaying behaviours that are atypical, and then those around them start to adopt those behaviours. So how might we apply a definition of a national, on a national level, a societal level, a general public level? How might we describe a mass psychosis or a epidemic hysteria? So I think a term that we are familiar with, has been used a lot in the last 10 or 20 years, certainly in describing political movements and policy decisions within political movements, is a term, or the term, groupthink. So what is the origin of the term groupthink, and what might it mean? So the term groupthink was coined in the early 70s by a psychologist called Irving Janis. And Janis describes or defines groupthink as a psychological drive for consensus at any cost that suppresses dissent and appraisal of alternatives in cohesive decision-making groups. So, to me, the interesting terms that are used within that definition of groupthink. So this is the originator of the term groupthink, which I think a lot of people now would be familiar with that term. So the originator of that term describes how you have to develop a consensus at any cost to meet the requirements of a groupthink scenario. So can we say that we are currently experiencing that now with this crisis, health crisis, the COVID-19 situation, and how our government, the UK government, other governments internationally, institutions that work alongside government, such as public health bodies and even law enforcement, education and academic establishments, have they fallen in line with a consensus that has been developed without much appraisal of alternative viewpoints? I would say that has most definitely happened. So what are the dangers of that happening? So what are the dangers of groupthink when it happens on such a universal, panoramic scale? So it affects so many institutions that deliver governance and guidance and rules and regulations over our lives. What are the dangers when that happens so swiftly without, I would suggest, proper scrutiny of alternative viewpoints? Well, I think one of the immediate dangers of that is you set off on a course that you may believe to be right as the spearhead of that consensus movement, but because you've not conducted a proper appraisal of alternative viewpoints, you've not considered the negative impacts of the outcomes of this new consensus, the desired outcomes, which I believe also has happened certainly in this country, and is something that we're seemingly experiencing internationally. Also, what happens when one of the characteristics of groupthink, and one of the functions, what we see is a function when a consensus that's developed to deal with a crisis unfolds, is that as time progresses, the consensus is initially established, and then it gathers more, gathers more ground. It consumes more institutions and more bodies and more people into that consensus. It becomes much harder to apply any kind of braking mechanism to that movement, to the direction and the goals of that consensus as each day passes. So if that consensus is having a very damaging effect on society at large, it becomes increasingly more difficult for any rational opposition to gain traction and a voice that is given any credence by the consensus. So essentially, opposing voices, opposing opinions, a critique of the consensus is drowned out by the overwhelming weight of the consensus. So that's a real danger of groupthink, I would suggest. Why are we susceptible to mass psychosis or mass hysteria, epidemic hysteria? Pick your choice of description there. Pick your noun of choice, your terminology of choice. Well, I would suggest we don't feel as individuals living within a society and having to mix and cooperate with not only our colleagues at work, but also our friends and neighbours. We generally, I would say it's a prevailing characteristic to not want to go against what is the kind of prevailing mood, or what is the kind of dominant opinion regards a particular topic or issue. So in the likes of this situation, COVID-19, it's even if you had grave doubts or doubts at any level about the policy decisions that were being made by the government, for example, maybe lockdown, and you had an awareness, and you not only from having conversations with the people around you, but just generally, you were picking up on the what seemed to be the majority opinion about things. So once when you have no awareness of that, and your doubts then by expressing them would place you outside of that majority opinion, I would say the more common or typical behaviour is to not express those doubts. And the bigger the consensus is, the bigger the majority opinion is, the more difficult it is for you as the individual to express your doubts about that opinion or issue. So we then, as individuals, or even groups of individuals, start to feel compelled to self-censor in social discourse with family and friends, with colleagues. We start to naturally feel compelled to self-censor, to keep our opinions to ourselves, to not self-identify within those groups that we don't agree with the group, that group, the larger group, the majority group. So on an individual basis, that's how consensuses can be quickly established, but also maintained, and that's how we can become susceptible to it, because you just need the perception in the minds of the most amount of people that the consensus has been established for the consensus to remain. Because once most people have the perception that this is the consensus, and it is by far and away a large consensus, that people will start to self-censor and not express contrary opinions to the consensus, for fear that will then isolate them, place them under scrutiny, or derogatory terms that they'll be categorized in a derogatory way by those who are on the consensus side. So that fear prevents people from speaking out. So can we say we've seen what examples can we draw from history of groupthink and consensus narratives that have defined regimes, defined eras, and what can we learn about those events? So the first example I would suggest would be the Russian Revolution of 1917. Basically the First World War. That quickly established a hierarchical structure that dictated what the outcomes of society should be, and it decided that once the revolution had taken place, between the warring parties, the White Army, the Bolsheviks, and other factions, lesser factions. But once the Red Army had won, and then therefore the ideology of the Red Army was in place, that groupthink was quickly established that projected its outcomes upon a nation as a whole. Can we say that was the outcome of that was positive? Can we say it was negative? You could certainly say there's arguments for both camps there. But what I think you could say was inarguable is it certainly shut down any kind of meaningful opposition voices to the established groupthink. The rise of fascism in Europe, subsequent to the Russian Revolution, of the early 30s. So the rise of fascism in Italy and Spain under Mussolini and Franco, respectively. Again, the regimes that we know and we accept were totalitarian in nature once they had been firmly established, and arguably, and also with the Russian Revolution, you could argue the point that it wasn't just a groupthink narrative that it was established those regimes and maintained those regimes. You could say maybe it was also the fear of very tangible fear of incarceration or even worse, death, that stopped people speaking out against the regime. So you could add that extra very much more visceral kind of pernicious element to the process of those regimes being established that stopped opposition. But I would argue that it was just also the factor of if being a minority, a voice against the weight of the state, the established state, but also knowing that most people would always fall in line with the state view, or would not challenge the state view, was simply enough to stop any opposition. So you wouldn't necessarily need the fear of incarceration or worse to make people stop pushing back against those regimes. Although they might have been very much those very kind of profound consequences were in place for someone who did speak out. They wouldn't necessarily be the most deterministic factor that stopped or suppressed any objectional voices. One of the biggest and best known examples of fascism would obviously in the last 100 years would obviously be the rise of the Third Reich under Hitler in Germany. Now, once again, how is it possible? How is it mechanistically possible for that regime to achieve what it achieved without some kind of groupthink being projected onto the citizens of that society in Germany at that time? Again, we can say that there was very genuine threats to the individual of incarceration and very, very definitely death for those who chose and were brave enough to speak out. But was that the most important deterministic factor in that regime being able to achieve what it achieved, to achieve the cooperation and I guess coordination of the people that would make the outcomes of that regime achievable? I don't think that would be possible if it wasn't, if to some level, just you could argue it's coercive, but non-violent, cooperation was achieved, and that was achieved through the fairly rapid evolution of groupthink under that regime, which you could argue was achieved by the propaganda that projected fears onto the nation. The nation of German citizens, fear of being usurped by a ethnic group that resided within the Jewish nation, fear that they would lose their identity if they didn't tackle those groups, fear that their nation state would become weak and be challenged and overrun by foreign power. So I think what could be said for all of these historical examples of the rise of fascism and totalitarian regimes, is they have to, and they did use elements of fear of a projected threat to the nation state at large, foreign and domestic. What examples could we pick for today? Well, I think you've obviously got the Chinese communist state. Very much has harvested groupthink psychology, certainly within the power mechanisms, the power strata of that country, to some degree, obviously within the citizens also. North Korea, maybe to an even more acute level, has achieved that. Again, we can also factor in the threat to the individual of imprisonment and worse that maybe stops dissension. But again, I would still find it. I would still challenge the notion that it's that alone that allows the continuation of the ideologies of that state. So the ruling family and the ruling class of North Korea has somehow successfully managed to project its groupthink onto the citizens of its nation to a very successful extent, and that's how it's managed to maintain power. So there are some examples. What are the natural breaks to groupthink and mass psychosis? Are these natural breaks being eroded in our society, in the UK, and let's say Western democracies at large? And what are the dangers of these natural breaks being eroded to preventing the potential rise of any fascist or totalitarian or very mono-theological regime? Open debate, freedom of speech, science, and the notion of democracy. So, open debate, I think, you can say unequivocally, has been eroded to some degree during this crisis, but also in preceding events. Could arguably Brexit. I think we have a lack of open debate available about certain identity politics issues, which I might address in a subsequent podcast. So I would say the platform or ground for open debate, where no subject or opinion is necessarily taboo or even blacklisted or prevented from being raised, I think has been eroded. It's very definitely been eroded. We've seen that in academic institutions that have blackballed various speakers coming to their academic institutions, their student unions, to speak on certain issues. We've seen how toxic and irascible debate on social media is, and how very polarized that is on any given topic of the day. Is extremely polarized, and therefore destroys any meaningful ground for open debate. Freedom of speech, we've again, there's many examples of in this particular global health crisis of COVID-19. There's many examples of clinicians and scientists and academics being deplatformed and having material censored from the internet and printed media. We've seen a lack of well-qualified rational voices being given an opportunity to express their opinions and their well-founded technical, expertly derived opinions and viewpoints in mainstream media, television, and radio. So we've seen a lack of freedom of speech there. We've seen that also bleeds into science. We've seen many scientists who have challenged the current situation, again, not being able to find a voice to challenge the narrative in the mainstream media. All of these things are very worrying, and should be very worrying to any individual who wants to continue to live in a society that seeks to constantly challenge the way forward for all within society and for all issues. That can only be achieved when you have freedom of speech, you have open debates, and you have unfettered access by those who have well-formed, well-educated, and well-arrived at positions on any particular technical subject. So how do we stop this? How do we challenge this? How do we push back against this age of censorship and narrative control, which leads to epidemic hysteria and groupthink? Well, first of all, is to not feel threatened that you can't express your opinion. Use what mechanisms you can, like I'm trying to use this mechanism here of the internet and recorded media to voice my opinions. But essentially, I would suggest is you need to arrive at your own decision, your own viewpoint, your own standpoint, your own rationale on any given subject that you feel is going to impact your life and your society, the society you live in. You need to invest in that process yourself, and don't accept things that you're being told on face value by one particular source of information, whether that be the government or the mainstream media. It's basically find out for yourself. Always ask, why am I being told this information? And who's telling me this information? So that's the end of this podcast. I hope that has made some sense. I would like to welcome you in commenting below the video, and I will see you again soon for the next episode of The Great Unlearning.